February 20, 1944. Lyceum, Germany. Temperature, -3 degrees Celsius. Oberleutnant Klaus Mayatusch, 24 years old, climbed into his Bf 109 G6 for the fourth sortie of the day. Around him, the Luftwaffe was dying. For 96 hours, American heavy bombers had been striking German aircraft factories while their fighter escorts destroyed any Luftwaffe plane that rose to challenge them. Mayatusch had already shot down 2 B-17s that morning, but his squadron had lost 6 pilots, men who couldn't be replaced. The Luftwaffe's personnel files would later show a stunning figure. In just 4 days, Germany lost approximately 1,200 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports destroyed in combat or on the ground. But the planes could theoretically be rebuilt. The pilots who went down with them could not. Mayatusch wrote in his diary that night, "We are sending boys up in fighters they barely know how to fly against pilots with hundreds of hours of experience. This is not combat. It is execution." This is the story of Operation Argument, what the Americans called Big Week, the battle that broke the Luftwaffe's back and ensured Allied air superiority for D-Day. To understand why Big Week destroyed the Luftwaffe, we need to understand what German air power looked like in early 1944. On paper, it appeared formidable. German factories were producing approximately 1,000 single-engine fighters per month. The Bf 109G and Fw-190A Luftwaffe strength stood at roughly 1,650 day fighters and 300 night fighters. But these numbers were deceptive. Behind them lay critical weaknesses. First, pilot quality. The experienced aces who'd fought since Poland and France were mostly dead. Their replacements averaged 60 hours of flight training. American pilots received 200 hours before entering combat. Second, fuel. The Plosti oil fields in Romania were under constant Allied attack. Synthetic fuel production couldn't meet demands. Pilots flew training missions at reduced throttle to conserve gasoline. Third, strategic dispersion. The Luftwaffe was fighting on 3 fronts, defending Germany from daylight American bombing, defending against RAF night raids, and supporting ground forces in Russia and Italy. There were never enough fighters in the right place. Fourth, Hitler's interference. He'd ordered fighter production diverted to bombers for retaliation raids against Britain exactly when fighters were needed most for defense. Into this fragile situation came Operation Argument, designed by American strategic planners to destroy German aircraft production and, more importantly, force the Luftwaffe into a battle of attrition it couldn't win. American strategic bombing doctrine in 1944 faced a critical problem. Unescorted heavy bombers were being shot down faster than they could accomplish their mission. In October 1943, the Schweinfurt raid lost 60 B-17s in a single day, a 26% loss rate that was unsustainable. But by early 1944, the equation had changed. The P-51 Mustang, with drop tanks giving it the range to escort bombers deep into Germany, entered service in numbers. Suddenly, American planners could think beyond survival to offensive operations. General Karl Spaatz, commanding U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, proposed a concentrated attack on German aircraft production, factories, assembly plants, and ball bearing facilities that supported aviation manufacturing. The offensive would force the Luftwaffe to defend its industrial base, exposing its fighters to American escort fighters that now outnumbered them and were flown by better trained pilots. It was a trap baited with B-17s and B-24s, designed to destroy the Luftwaffe fighter force before D-Day made air superiority essential. The weather would determine timing. Strategic bombing required visual conditions to hit precision targets. February 1944 had been overcast for weeks. Then, on February 19, meteorologists predicted a break, 4 to 6 days of clear skies over central Germany. Spaatz ordered Operation Argument to begin immediately. On February 20, 1944, over 1,000 American heavy bombers lifted off from English airfields, escorted by 800 fighters, heading for targets across Germany. The first day's targets were aircraft assembly plants at Leipzig and Tutow. Intelligence estimated 200 German fighters would rise to meet them. 360 actually scrambled. The Luftwaffe couldn't let its production facilities be destroyed without response. Over Leipzig, the air battle began shortly after noon. American gunners on the B-17s reported wave after wave of German fighters attacking in groups of 40 to 50 coordinated assaults designed to overwhelm defensive fire and break formations. But the German pilots faced something new, P-51 Mustangs diving through their attack formations before they could reach the bombers. Major James Howard, flying a P-51 with the 354th Fighter Group, became separated from his squadron and found himself alone defending an entire bomber formation from 30 German fighters. For 30 minutes, he engaged Bf-109s and FW-190s in swirling dogfights, downing 6 confirmed and driving off the rest until other escorts arrived. He would receive the Medal of Honor, the only fighter pilot in the European theater to earn that decoration. But Howard's heroics represented the larger reality. American fighter pilots now had technological and numerical superiority. The P-51 was faster than the Bf-109G at all altitudes and could outturn the FW-190A at high speeds. American pilots had fuel to engage in extended combat. German pilots, rationed on fuel during training, had to disengage when tanks reached quarter full to ensure they could return to base. Day 1 cost the Luftwaffe 28 fighters confirmed destroyed in combat, with dozens more damaged. But those numbers were deceptive, they represented only air-to-air losses. On the ground, Messerschmitt's Leipzig factory took heavy damage. Production dropped 40% for the following month. More critically, 14 Luftwaffe pilots with over 20 kills each, irreplaceable experienced leaders, were shot down. One was killed. The others were wounded severely enough to be out of action for months. The American losses were also significant: 21 bombers, 5 fighters. But American production replaced those aircraft in 2 days. The crews took longer to replace, but training pipelines in the United States were producing them in steady numbers. Germany had no equivalent replacement system. Day 2, February 21, brought worse weather. Some missions were scrubbed, but attacks continued on aircraft component factories and ball bearing plants. The Luftwaffe's response was more desperate. Gruppencommander Major Gunther Speck led his entire Geschwader in a mass attack on a bomber stream near Brunswick. His fighters broke through the escort screen and shot down 13 B-17s in 15 minutes. Then P-47 Thunderbolts dove into the melee. In the swirling dogfight that followed, Speck's unit lost 9 fighters. He survived, but 3 of his 4 squadron commanders did not. One officer later wrote, "We're winning tactical victories that mean nothing because we can't replace what we lose." The Americans replace everything. February 22 was the critical day. Over 900 American heavy bombers attacked aircraft factories at Schweinfurt, Gotha, Regensburg, and other targets. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, targets clearly identifiable. The Luftwaffe threw everything available into the battle: day fighters, night fighters converted for day operations, even training units with instructors and advanced students. Approximately 400 German fighters engaged. The air battles raged across central Germany for 5 hours. Over Schweinfurt, a formation of B-17s from the 91st Bomb Group came under sustained attack from JG-11, one of the Luftwaffe's elite defense of the Reich units. In 40 minutes of continuous combat, the 91st lost 11 bombers. But JG-11 lost 17 fighters and, more critically, 12 pilots who would never return to combat. The mathematics were unsustainable. America could afford to trade bombers for fighters because bombers could be replaced in days and crews in weeks. Germany could build fighters quickly. Production was actually increasing despite the bombing, but training pilots took 6 months minimum, and fuel shortages meant new pilots arrived at squadrons with as little as 30 hours in type. They were being sent into combat against veterans with hundreds of hours. One Luftwaffe training officer wrote, "We are feeding children to wolves and calling it air defense." The pattern repeated on February 23 and 24. Each day, hundreds of bombers struck aircraft production facilities. Each day, the Luftwaffe rose to defend. Each day, German losses exceeded what could be replaced. But the destruction wasn't only in the air. On the ground, American bombers were systematically destroying Germany's aircraft production infrastructure. The Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg took repeated hits. The Erla Maschinenwerk in Leipzig, which produced Bf 109 components, was devastated. Junkers assembly plant at Aschersleben stopped production entirely. Even more critically, component suppliers, the small factories producing engines, propellers, instruments, and other parts, were being destroyed faster than they could be rebuilt. German aircraft production would actually peak in September 1944, showing the resilience of dispersed manufacturing. But by then, the problem wasn't planes, it was pilots and fuel. The Luftwaffe had lost its experienced fighter force in battles like Big Week and would never recover. By February 25, the sixth and final day of Operation Argument, the Luftwaffe's response was noticeably weaker. Entire fighter groups that had launched 40 aircraft on February 20 could now barely manage 20. Pilots who'd flown 4 sorties daily on the first days were exhausted, physically and mentally broken by constant combat. The final tally was devastating. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 355 fighters destroyed in air combat, another 100 bombers and transport aircraft, and at least 500 aircraft destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks. Total, just under 1,000 aircraft. But that number doesn't include damaged aircraft written off as beyond economical repair, bringing the total closer to 1,200. But the numbers that truly mattered were the pilots. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 300 pilots killed, missing, or so severely wounded they never returned to combat during Big Week. These weren't just numbers, they were the operational backbone of German fighter defense. Squadron commanders with 50 kills. Flight leaders who'd been flying since 1940. The men who'd taught new pilots how to survive. Major Heinz Bahr, one of Germany's top aces with 220 victories, was shot down twice during Big Week, surviving both times, but suffering injuries that kept him out of action for weeks. Hauptmann Klaus Mayatusch, the pilot from our opening, survived all 4 days but was killed 3 months later, his unit having been rebuilt with inexperienced pilots who couldn't provide mutual support. The Americans lost 247 aircraft destroyed and 28 damaged beyond repair. Approximately 2,600 aircrew were killed, wounded, or captured. By any measure, these were heavy losses. But America's training system was producing 100,000 aircrew annually. Aircraft production was running at 9,000 heavy bombers per year. The losses from Big Week were replaced within 3 weeks. Germany's pilot training system, crippled by fuel shortages and operating from bases under constant attack, was producing fewer than 2,000 fighter pilots annually, and quality was declining as training time decreased. The Luftwaffe would never again mount the kind of sustained, coordinated defense it managed during Big Week. By D-Day, 3 months later, the Allies would achieve total air superiority over the invasion beaches. German fighters were nearly absent from Normandy's skies, not because they didn't exist, but because the pilots who could fly them effectively had been destroyed in battles like Operation Argument. The strategic impact of Big Week extended far beyond the immediate aircraft and pilot losses. It fundamentally altered the balance of air power over Europe, with cascading consequences for the rest of the war. First, German day fighter operations became reactive rather than proactive. Before Big Week, the Luftwaffe could concentrate forces for major defensive operations. After Big Week, chronic pilot shortages meant units operated at 50 to 60% strength, making coordinated large-scale operations nearly impossible. Second, the destruction of aircraft production facilities forced German industry into further dispersion. Factories were broken into smaller units hidden in forests, caves, and small towns. This actually increased production numbers by late 1944, but it created logistics nightmares. Completed aircraft often sat at factories for weeks awaiting transport to airfields. Third, and most critically, pilot training collapsed entirely. By mid-1944, new Luftwaffe fighter pilots were arriving at operational squadrons with as little as 20 hours in their assigned aircraft type. They were being shot down on their first or second missions by American pilots with 300 hours of experience. German aces who survived Big Week found themselves leading formations of teenagers who didn't understand basic combat tactics. Fourth, fuel shortages became critical. The Plosti oil fields in Romania, supplying 70% of Germany's petroleum, came under sustained American bombing from April 1944 onward. By September, fuel was so scarce that newly produced aircraft sat on airfields unable to fly. Pilots assigned to them never gained operational experience because there was no fuel for training flights. The human stories from Big Week reveal the larger strategic picture. Oberleutnant Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace with 28 kills, survived Big Week and flew combat until March 1945. After the war, he immigrated to Canada and spent decades haunted by memories of watching young pilots under his command shot down on their first missions. He described one teenager killed on February 23. He'd had 30 hours total flight time. He lasted 4 minutes in combat. The American who shot him down probably thought it was easy. It wasn't skill. It was murder. On the American side, Lieutenant Robert Johnson, a P-47 pilot with the 56th Fighter Group, shot down 5 German fighters during Big Week, but also watched his wingman go down over Germany, captured and imprisoned for the war's duration. Johnson wrote, "We celebrated the victories, but every night I thought about the men we'd lost. The bombers we couldn't protect. The Germans were brave, they kept coming back every day even though they knew we outnumbered them. I respected them even as we killed them." By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively lost air superiority over Germany itself. American bombers operated with near impunity, systematically destroying oil production, transportation networks, and war industries. The Germans continued to produce fighters. Monthly production actually increased to 3,300 aircraft by September 1944, but they couldn't produce the fuel to fly them or the pilots to fly them effectively. Aircraft sat on airfields, beautifully manufactured machines that would never see combat because there was no fuel and no trained pilots. The final accounting of Big Week's impact goes beyond aircraft and pilots to the strategic situation. When Operation Overlord, the D-Day invasion, launched on June 6, 1944, 3 months after Big Week, the Luftwaffe managed only 319 sorties over the landing beaches. The Allies flew over 14,000. German ground forces in Normandy fought without effective air support, constantly harassed by Allied fighter bombers, unable to move during daylight without being attacked from the air. Field Marshal Owen Rommel, commanding German forces in France, wrote to Hitler, "The enemy has complete command of the air. Our own air force has been virtually eliminated." This was Big Week's legacy. By destroying the experienced fighter force in February 1944, Operation Argument had ensured that 3 months later, when Allied air superiority was absolutely critical, the Luftwaffe couldn't contest it. The 1,200 aircraft lost during Big Week, and more importantly, the 300 experienced pilots killed, could not be replaced in time. Historians debate whether Big Week was the decisive turning point in the air war or merely one battle in a larger campaign of attrition. What's indisputable is that after February 1944, the Luftwaffe never again achieved the coordination and effectiveness it showed defending Germany during those 6 days. The pilot losses, combined with fuel shortages and industrial disruption, created a spiral of decline that Germans couldn't reverse. As one Luftwaffe officer summarized, "Big Week didn't defeat us immediately. It started a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Each day we were a little weaker. Each day they were stronger. By June, we were already finished, we just didn't know it yet." Klaus Mayatush, the pilot from our opening, survived Big Week. He continued flying combat missions as his squadron was repeatedly rebuilt with inexperienced pilots. On September 17, 1944, he was shot down and killed near Nijmegen during Operation Market Garden, not by enemy fighters, but by German anti-aircraft fire that mistook his damaged aircraft for an Allied plane. He was 24 years old. His squadron had been destroyed and rebuilt 4 times since February. Of the pilots who'd flown with him during Big Week, he was the last survivor. Operation Argument Big Week remains studied at military staff colleges as a case study in strategic air power. It demonstrated that air superiority could be achieved not just by destroying aircraft, but by destroying the trained pilots who flew them and the industrial base that supported them. The 1,200 aircraft Germany lost in 96 hours represented 3 months of production, significant, but replaceable. The 300 experienced pilots killed represented 4 years of training and combat experience, irreplaceable under wartime conditions. This distinction between material and human losses defines modern warfare. Technology can be rebuilt. Trained personnel cannot be quickly replaced. The Luftwaffe discovered this truth in the skies over Germany in February 1944. American strategic planners understood it and designed Operation Argument specifically to exploit it. The battle lasted 96 hours. Its consequences lasted until Germany's surrender 15 months later. Today, the airfields where these battles were fought are quiet. Some are commercial airports. Others are farmland. Small memorials mark where aircraft fell and men died, both American and German. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia preserves the history of the American bomber crews. The Deutsches Museum in Munich documents the Luftwaffe's rise and fall. These stories deserve to be remembered, not to glorify war, but to understand how strategic decisions made under pressure, the courage of men on both sides, and the mathematics of attrition combined to determine history's course. Big Week was 96 hours when the balance tipped irreversibly toward Allied victory. 1,200 German aircraft that were never replaced, and more importantly, 300 pilots whose experience and skill vanished from the war. The machines could be rebuilt. The men could not.